Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Objective. And we're going to be talking about a topic today you probably never thought you would hear about again. There's still trouble in the Middle East. Surprisingly enough, I thought it was going to be over within a few days. We've got a situation that is more difficult, I think, to understand and address than previous problems confronting Israel and the Palestinians. Mostly we would hear about missiles flying out of Gaza or about terrorism being encouraged and rewarded out of the West Bank. At least that's my understanding as someone in the US. But all of that is pretty easy to deal with compared to what I'm hearing about now, which is that Israeli Arabs have been radicalized in a way that maybe they weren't in previous decades. And there's violence erupting in neighborhoods, in areas that Israel is currently governing, that is part of Israel. So this is going to be a difficult thing to deal with, I think, and it is a difficult thing to deal with. Here in the US, I've seen obviously violence by people who believe that America is systematically oppressive and racist, but the type of violence in America is comparatively like children throwing a brief tantrum, I think, when you compare it to the level of hostility and longevity, persistence that I think can be expected from Palestinians. So good luck. Thank you all for joining us today. Actually, okay, let's try to solve this problem. I'm here with two people. We've got a guy he's from Greece, and I think he's thanking his lucky stars every day that his nation failed to conquer this chaotic region. Happy Hanukkah indeed. Nikos Sotirakopoulos.
Thanks. Thank you, Rucka.
And we've got a special guest today. She is a news anchor reporter based out of New York, but Israeli. And her name is Tal Heinrich.
Oh my God, you said it perfect. You pronounced it amazing. Thank you. Great to be with you guys.
Great to have you. So what exactly would you tell somebody like me who's sort of like from the outside looking in? What is happening in Israel, if you could summarize?
So this is the biggest round of escalation that we've seen between Israel and Gaza, Israel and the Palestinians since the war in the summer of 2014. The attacks by Hamas have been getting more and more sophisticated, challenging the Iron Dome system. And also, as you mentioned, the domestic front at home. It's a very challenging situation for the Israeli police and the Israeli military police, especially in mixed Israeli and Arab towns. And many people that I talk to say that this is even the bigger challenge than, just like you put it out in the beginning. I mean, yes, there are more missiles right now than in 2014. Sometimes we're talking about, a barrage of over 100 missiles at once and they're also firing them sometimes lower because Hamas is trying to really bypass the Iron Dome missile defense system. And honestly, they got lucky many times with direct hits at homes in several towns in the south. Ashkelon saw heavy fire yesterday. Beersheba, also a city in the south of Israel. And again, not only, I mean, the domestic front, I think people are telling me that this is what makes them even, sadder about the entire situation.
So can I ask a layman's question about the domestic frontal? So the average Arab who is a citizen of Israel. So to clarify here, we're not talking about people in the West Bank or people in Gaza. We're talking about people who are Israeli citizens. So, and we see that many, sorry?
Yeah. No, I'm saying correct. Not Palestinians, what we call Israeli Arabs.
Israeli Arabs,
that's how we define it.
So what is the issue with, let's say, their allegiance in this conflict? Is it a religion allegiance towards the Palestinians? Is it a political allegiance, more like people who are towards the left? Or is it a more tribal, let's say, allegiance that some people had family who had to leave in 48 or who lost their houses in 67 or something like that? So the average person who is now in the streets rioting or protesting, what is the background and what goes in the mind of that person?
It's a very good question, and I think there is no one answer because each individual Israeli Arab that you will talk to will give you a totally different answer. I don't know if I can make this parallel, but because you are in Europe right now, think about second generation Muslims who immigrated to Europe. It's some sort of an identity question. Or Turks, second, third generation living in Germany. What do you feel more, a Turk or a German? You'll get different answers, or a Muslim. You will get different answers from different people in Israel. Some Israeli Arabs, I mean, some of my friends, they 100% feel Israelis. Yes, they speak Arabic, they are Muslim, but they would tell you that my first identity, I'm just an Israeli, I'm like anyone else. Yes, I have something different than the majority Jewish population running in my blood, which might even shape my perceptions, they will tell you, but others will give you a completely different answers. They will say, we are Palestinians. There's no difference between me and a Palestinian that you see in Gaza. So that's why we can't really generalize and refer to this population in Israel as a monolith, because it's a very, very complex society. But these people, of course, that are I don't want to say protesting, peacefully protesting. That's the term that's been used here in the United States. I've been telling, I've been doing some reports to Israeli media outlets, and they asked me a lot about, my perspective looking at this from the United States, reminiscing on the violent summer that we've had here with the riots and protests. And I told them, you know what, at least in Israel, when I see the coverage, I know that nobody would call these atrocities in the streets peaceful protests, nobody. And I know that no lawmaker will even think of, fundraising to release criminals and contributing to their bailout and so on, paying their bail, which are things that we saw here. So I always say the Israeli society as a whole is still in a much better, healthier place than what I see here in the United States. I draw a lot of confidence and hope from there, because most Israelis and Arabs know to tell the difference between good and right. And I don't think I can so easily say the same about the American society after having experienced what I see here. But going back to Israel, I think, I mean, just like in any other country, the domestic front is the most challenging one, because everyone's asking in Israel, where is the police? Why aren't they doing it? And, police, as much as some of us may think, they just can't walk around the streets and shoot people who are smashing windows, lynching other people. They just can't. It's impossible. First, it's a directive, but also based on past domestic confrontations, not even during war times. You know what happens to these police officers, what kind of interrogations they have to go through. So it's very challenging to just be a police officer and pull out your gun and start shooting around. It's not realistic.
Rucka, before we go back to you, just to give a bit of context to our audience, we're not talking about the usual stuff that happens in a violent protest, like some cars were smashed. I've read somewhere that there were five synagogues, burned, which then begs the question, could it be also that there's not only the civil, let's say, conflict there, the political aspect, but there's also an aspect of these are Jews, attack them. So do you see also the element of anti-Semitism there? Or would you say, no, it's a political conflict and this is just an act of political violence?
So it's a combination of both. It's two world views, perceptions clashing all together, and some would say that this is by part also what ignited this round of escalation as one of the more imminent triggers. I'm not talking about the political conditions and the cancellation of the Palestinian elections and all of that, but I'll say that a few weeks ago or a month ago, some videos have gone very viral in Jerusalem and in Israel of a Palestinian teenager punching a young Orthodox Jew in the not subway, it's the light rail that we call it in Jerusalem, in public transportation. And this video has gone very viral. And suddenly we started seeing copycat assaults of this kind. So that started protests of young Jewish Orthodox and counter protests by Israeli Arabs in East Jerusalem. And the Israeli police has found it very difficult to handle it back then. So things started to deteriorate also on that front. I mean, it's been brewing for a while. And I have to say, to be fair, we have to say that, one violence leads to another. So some in Israel, some especially, young Zionist Jewish Orthodox, they sometimes come to these mixed Israeli Arab cities and they say, we are here to defend our brothers and sisters, that the police is not able to help them. And then they also instigate violence. And we saw a lynching. They say that it was an attempted ramming attack, but nobody knows still. But the bottom line, an Israeli Arab was lynched by Israeli Jews. But one act of violence leads to another.
Am I correct to say that the Israeli Arabs are like radicalized in recent years in a way that maybe they weren't a couple decades ago, to be initiating violence the way they are?
It's only parts of the, I mean, again, it's only parts of the society, because I think as a whole, there are also different processes that we've been seeing within this society. I'll give you an example. For example, many Israeli Arabs, they just stopped voting for the Arab parties and they vote for, Jewish Israeli parties with no Arab representatives, because sometimes they feel, and I think we've seen it in the first two rounds of 2019 as well, of elections. They just feel as if the Israeli Arab representatives are not speaking for them, not addressing their problems. So they're voting for different parties, not based upon their Arab identity. So it's only part of the population. Plus, keep in mind that one of the more, I'll say, the kingmaker party of this latest round of election and is an Israeli Arab party, which is really interesting because this guy who's the head of the party, his name is Mansour Abbas. He's a member of the Israeli parliament, and basically he broke away with the bigger Israeli Arab party. It's called the Joint List. And for the first time, there was actually a real talk about an Israeli Arab party, supporting a government and being part of the coalition. So I don't think, I mean, on one hand, you are 100% right. On the other hand, there are different parts of this society which don't really fall into categories. So we're seeing two different processes happening, or even more.
My question is mainly about acts of violence being initiated. Was there were there generally terrorist acts or just arson and stuff like that being initiated by Israeli Arabs in the 90s, let's say, or 2000s?
We definitely see it happening sometimes, from cities from East Jerusalem, Al-Fahim, lone wolf assailants, they walk around, do their thing. In some ways, many Israelis, I'm following what's, the newscasts in Israel now very, very often. So especially this week, and I keep hearing from Israelis that this part of society has been somewhat neglected, by part on purpose, by the Israeli government and by the Israeli police and authorities, because it's some sort of an autonomy, I would say. Like, everyone knows that those Israeli Arab towns, you can go there and find lots of weapons, for example. They use them in weddings. They use them, for crime, to celebrate, not to celebrate. And everyone knows that. And even, many Israeli Arabs have been complaining about that, to be honest. And they want the police to intervene and gather those illegal weapons that are there. But it's just, there's a status quo with the Palestinians, but there's also a status quo of this kind with the Israeli Arabs, that you'll do your thing, we will do our thing, we'll try not to clash. And now many Israeli citizens are saying, well, this kind of approach is not really working. It may work with the Palestinians to have the status quo for a while, for a long time until we find some solution or, arrangement. But within Israel, this kind of, just looking the other way is just not working anymore, because we see how things are unfolding now.
Can I ask another layman's question, which goes slightly beyond that, but we have a very knowledgeable person, so I'll make use of it. So most people would see this conflict and wonder, what exactly is Hamas trying to do? Or actually, what are they hoping to do? Because every few years, we see the same pattern. We see some escalation, which leads in the Israeli army significantly cutting the force that Hamas. So basically, every conflict is led to a small defeat for Hamas, at least on a military level. That's how I've understood the last 10, 15 years. So the question is this: what is Hamas trying to do with this escalation? So do they hope that the international community will turn more against Israel? But then again, the question is towards what? What are they trying to achieve? And are they stalling, or do they try to keep the conflict open? But the question is, for what end? Since every time they are more and more and more defeated, let's say, on the military field.
Oh, totally. But, they have their own winning images of multiple rockets over the skies of Tel Aviv. These are winning images. Many Israelis, running for their lives, sitting in shelters. It's been intense bombarding there. So these are some sort of victory images that they can present the world. And I think they had to regain their place within the Palestinian society and the Arab world. And I'll explain. It's not only aimed at the international community, as you say, Nikos, but just remember that not so long ago, about half a year ago, we signed the Abraham Accords with the UAE and Bahrain. And suddenly, headlines and just think tank discussions declared an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is somewhat correct, because suddenly we see that Israel is no longer a taboo for so many of these countries, and it doesn't mean that you need to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to have ties with Israel. And we can say peace. It's peace. It's not only normalization. It's actually peace. The last half year has been incredible. I have Israeli friends who are living, working in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi. I personally have friends in Bahrain that I talk to about the situation. And you know what? The reactions that I've been getting, off air, I will say, from some people from the Gulf, they actually understand what Israel is going through. They support Israel's actions against Hamas, and in this way, it's also against Iran 100%, which is, it doesn't mean that they are not sharing the pain of the Palestinian people in Gaza. I personally have, friends here in the US whose parents, whose families are in Gaza right now, but, we still talk, we are still friends, we don't think alike, but it's possible. So Hamas is trying to, I would say, remove a layer of shame. And, shame one time because some Arab nations have started, talking to Israel, normalizing ties with them. And that's shame number one. Shame number two is, with the Trump administration, they've been getting support from Qatar. Money used to come in, we're talking about millions and millions of dollars. And I think they had at least 3 or 5 big batches of money coming in, which is, for them, it was pretty shameful that, you always need to be, you need to be saved. And they were the ones who were getting the money. It's like, it's a bit humiliating that, Qatar and Egypt and the Trump administration behind the scenes are running the show. Plus, keep in mind that all was sort of coordinated with Israel. So it was some sort of indirect talks between Hamas and Israel. I'll call it this way. It was some sort of an arrangement. So Hamas suddenly became, if you ask some Israelis or Israeli experts, they would say that Mahmoud Abbas is the main impediment to peace, not even Hamas, So now they need to restore their image as this, force that is fighting Israel, the military wing of Mukawama.
Their street credibility, basically, among
resistance.
other radicals in the wider milieu, let's say, in the Arab war. Yeah, makes sense. Rucka, I have one more question, but I don't want to.
And
Sorry,
there's the backdrop of the Palestinian elections that were canceled. The Palestinian elections were canceled, so they're also furious about that. They wanted to go ahead with the elections, the first elections in 15 years. As you know, Mahmoud Abbas is now serving, his fourth year. I mean, it was supposed to be a 4-year term, but it somehow became 15-year terms. So he canceled the elections. Of course, he doesn't want Hamas to take over also in the West Bank. So it helps them in many ways.
Is this a possibility that Hamas could take over the West Bank?
Of course, it's a possibility. And you know what? I'm not sure it's not. I mean, of course, it's not a real interest of Mahmoud Abbas or a real interest of Israel in the international community. But for Israel, this might serve as, a talking point. I told you so. We withdrew from Gaza. Look what happened there. You got Hamastan. This is how they say. Now look what's happening in the West Bank. Now we can't. Of course, we can't withdraw from there.
Makes sense.
That's what Israel will say.
Let's read some super chats on this uplifting note. Jeff, thank you for the super chat. We got Marilyn and Robert they're having a contest of who could send the most super chats. Thank you for all that. They say this is how conflicts should be resolved. We want to see that. And Hugh sends over some euros and says, or some pounds. He says, if Mexico were to throw rockets into San Diego, Mexico City would be captured on the same day. Amazing to see liberals siding with literal terrorists. I'm not entirely sure I agree with all of that, but it raises some interesting points. I mean, well, I guess let's use this as a launch pad, Tal. In Israel, I've heard it said that the sort of leftism, like the sort of peacenik left, doesn't really exist in a way that it used to. There's like people have just kind of like realized like trading land for peace is it's just clearly not working. So there's sort of a race for the center in Israeli politics. Do I understand correctly?
100%. The Israeli left, what we call the Oslo Accord coalition, the Labor Party plus the Meretz Party, which is a bit more extreme to the left, they lost many seats in parliament. I mean, it used to be a legit, a legit force in Israeli politics, but now I think they have something like 10, 12 seats. I mean, we've had so many elections that I can't even count. So it's somewhere in between 10 to, let's say, 12 seats in parliament, which is nothing out of a parliament of 120 delegates. So there's no question that the Israeli society has shifted rightwards over the last decade or so. With the disappointment of the Oslo Accords. Okay, so I don't know if you guys know Dr. Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz, but they are, Dr. Einat Wilf I'll just talk about a bit about their theory or about their research and tell you the story, because these are two people. She was a left-wing centrist parliamentarian in Israel, and he worked for Haaretz as an editor. Haaretz is like the New York Times of Israel, a left-wing publication. And they both were very disappointed that one peace initiative after another, one generous offer after another, was rejected by the Palestinians. And the Oslo Accords, we all know where it led the Israeli society, buses exploding in major cities across Israel. So they decided to go and research and talk to Palestinians from all walks of life and try to realize what's the real impediment to peace. Because you, Rucka, you bring up the land, lands for peace scheme and how the Israelis realize that it's not really working. So they try to understand, what do they really want? Because some of these offers seriously offer them, East Jerusalem, lands in the West Bank, autonomy in Gaza, and so on. Really, with Ehud Barak and then with Ehud Olmert, the former Israeli prime ministers, I think those offers really were around 90 something, met 90 something percent of their demand. So these two, the journalist and the former parliamentarian, they talked to Palestinians from all walks of life. And they realized that the minute you start narrowing down the discussion and you ask them, what do they really want? Do you want, is it statehood? Is it land? Is it Jerusalem? Is it what? It always boils down to the right of return, the so-called right of return, the idea that Palestinians, whether in Gaza, in Jordan, in Lebanon, have the right to return to the land which they now see as, which is now Israel. So, and UNRWA, the UN agency, is actually perpetuating this perception that if you are a Palestinian, you can be a seventh generation, sixth generation, you are still considered to be a so-called refugee, although you've been born somewhere else and whatever, you can still keep your rights as a refugee, and one day you'll get to return. So, and fulfilling the so-called right of return, we're talking about, they are talking in terms of more than, 10 million so-called Palestinian refugees. It basically means the annihilation of the state of Israel. So this couple that I just described, the authors of this book, it's called The War of Return, have realized that what the Palestinians actually want is that there wouldn't be a Jewish state. Many of them believe that they have the right to return to this territory, that they don't really differentiate between the territory of Haifa or Tel Aviv or a kibbutz or the West Bank.
Can we clarify something, Tal, to the audience, just to understand something about the refugee and the return? We're not talking about, let's say, 5 people who were living in a house, they were kicked out of the house, and now these 5 people need to come back. We're talking, because as you said, there have been generations in between, we're talking something like 6 times the amount of people who left, and many of these people are not anymore even alive. 6 times the amount of that people now somehow having to return, and as you said, return and kick up people out of their properties who are now their properties, or without a claim, is this your house? Were you kicked out of this house? So we're not talking about this particular injustice which says this family was kicked out of this house, therefore this family needs to come back. We're talking about a multiplied amount of people who somehow need to return. So I just needed to clarify this for people who think that, oh, this is some people who were kicked out and now they have to return. These very same people. Sorry, continue.
No, it's in the very existence of UNRWA, the UN agency dedicated solely for Palestinian refugees, is something that perpetuates this idea, and they actually believe that it's their land without any even legal proof that they can come and say, oh, this was my house, or discuss some monetary compensation or whatever. But really, in most cases, it's really nothing. And we're talking about people, for essence, my family side, my mom's side of the family, they came from Morocco. Am I to be considered a Moroccan refugee? Am I a European refugee? Because the other part of my family is from Ukraine, Romania it used to be. No, I don't see myself this way.
And what a shame for the neighboring regimes that they kept the refugees in a situation of perpetual poverty, of perpetual so deliberately not making them part of these communities, to use them basically as political pawns. So again, people should ask themselves,
100%.
why are we talking about refugees half a century after when they were kicked out of the land, or even more, kicked out or left the land voluntarily, as many did in 48? So that's a question that people need to ask. That's how can it be that they're still considered refugees? So for example, the Greeks who left the Asia Minor in 22, you wouldn't consider them still today their ancestor refugees. So why, particularly in this case, are we still talking about refugees indiscriminately? And again, not about individual cases where you could have a legitimate claim in land or in a
Exactly.
house.
Exactly. And that's the main impediment of the entire conflict. I mean, zooming out and out of what we're seeing playing out in Israel right now. I mean,
Fabian and Jonathan, thank you for the super chats. Looks like we got some fans of our guest in the chat. They're saying Tal Gadot. That's nice. This is an uplifting episode, isn't it? I mean, it's the whole, the Hamas versus Israel, obviously very, very frustrating and sad. But when it comes to violence among Israeli citizens and like there being no real easy way to address the problem, or I don't really know, or even a difficult way to address it. Very disheartening. I think we're about ready to jump over to Clubhouse. So if you all want to join us over there, coming up in 90 minutes, the Integrating Investor with Seth Levine. He's going to be talking about Bitcoin and decentralized finance, part 3. Then at 10 p.m. UK time, 5 Eastern, The Psychology of Hank Rearden. That's the character from Hank Rearden part 2. More on Hank Rearden. Part of the series on the psychology of the Atlas Shrugged characters. Let me remind the audience, let me say this. Let me get a little poetic for a minute. The Jews and the Israelis, they're known to hold on to the dream for a long time, whether it's the Zionists believing that a state is possible, or whether it's the religious Jews believing that the Messiah will arrive any minute. I will offer that if Israeli intellectuals would give Ayn Rand a chance, would study and teach Ayn Rand, I do believe that a lot of these problems would be addressed quicker than you think. But the battle needs to be intellectual, ultimately. It is ethical. That is what we see over and over again, whether it's hostility erupting in Israel, or whether it's Israel's inability to confront the hostility, and just a variety of other problems. Ultimately, it is ethics and it is philosophy. So please look to the namesake of this network, folks. Look to Ayn Rand and, think about it. Thank you all for joining us today. It's always a fascinating experience for me speaking to an Israeli, because I grew up speaking bad English in Jerusalem. And every time I speak to an Israeli, I forget how to speak English. It's a fascinating experience each time.
Rucka, apparently there's one last super chat that we need to address.
I'm looking for it now. I don't see it. Is it? Oh, Fabian? What do you mean?
Yes.
I don't know. Oh, I thanked him for the super chat. He says, seeing how little response there was to ISIS attacks, I'm skeptical that US and EU would retaliate anywhere near as decisively as people think. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about the sort of guilt or the lack of, I can't speak English, but the lack of assertiveness on the side of the West that me and certainly Razi behind the scenes have a lot to say about. We've mostly, I think, just discussed the problem and how sort of irrational a lot of the Palestinian side of the conflict is, but not so much on kind of what Israel could be doing better in the opinion of some of us here at the Ayn Rand Center UK. And maybe more on that next time. We'd love to have you back on the show, Tal. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Tal.
Thank you, Nikos, as well.
thank you.
And thank you all for watching. We're jumping over to Clubhouse, and we'll see you back here for the Daily Objective on Monday. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.